A lot of people treat environmental standards like these static rule books just gathering dust on a shelf somewhere. But actually, frameworks like ISO 14001:2026, they're living, breathing ecosystems. They're literally designed to adapt dynamically. So in this explainer, we're going to dive into exactly what happens to your environmental management system, your EMS, when your organization goes through a massive disruptive change. We're talking about the kind of high-stakes operational upgrade that tests the absolute limits of your framework. Because let's face it, if your systems aren't built for resilience, a major disruption is going to crack your foundation right open.
To really wrap our heads around this, let's picture a super specific, high-tech scenario. Imagine a manufacturing plant completely overhauling its floor. They're dropping in brand new, fully automated robotic machinery. Not the exact same time, there's a state-of-the-art holographic overlay, instantly analyzing the resulting shifts in energy and waste metrics across the whole facility. And hey, we're not talking science fiction here. This is the very real, data-driven environment modern organizations are operating in today. This kind of automation is the ultimate catalyst for systematic change. It forces you to ask, is your EMS genuinely equipped to handle rapid evolution? If your EMS isn't actively scaling alongside this new tech, you're opening the door to massive risks, wild inefficiencies, and worst-case scenario facility shutdowns.
Now, when that holographic overlay kicks in, it immediately flags a really stark contrast. You've got the old machinery's clunky, inefficient energy profile standing right next to the new automated system's really intensive, but very different power demands. Plus, you see this immediate shift in waste output. And what this data proves, for sure, is that your EMS cannot just be a static binder you dust off once a year for an auditor. It has to be a living system. If energy usage suddenly spikes, or if the chemical makeup of your waste completely changes because of the robots, the EMS needs to capture and manage those shifts instantly. If you ignore that fresh data, well, you're essentially flying blind, bleeding money on hidden inefficiencies, and risking some really serious environmental infractions. When you bring in something as massive as factory automation, Clause 6.3 of the standard gives us a pretty stark choice. On one hand, we can systematically manage the transition. If we do that, we maintain the integrity of our environmental controls, protect the bottom line, and keep the business running smoothly. On the other hand, we risk the absolute chaos of unmanaged change. And the source material here is unambiguous. Unmanaged change leads directly to major audit nonconformances. Actually, scratch that. It's worse than just an audit failure. If you change the physical reality of your factory without updating your environmental planning, your whole EMS just loses its connection to reality. You're exposing yourself to legal penalties and completely losing stakeholder trust. It's literally the difference between a massive strategic win and a total operational disaster. Okay, let's move right into Clause 4.3, EMS Scope, redrawing the map. So you literally can't manage what you haven't fenced in, right? The scope is the absolute foundation of your entire environmental system. By definition, your scope covers physical, organizational, operational, and functional boundaries. When you drop heavily automated machinery onto a production floor, it tests every single one of those boundaries. You have to redraw the map. Your EMS scope must reflect your actual environmental reality, not just some convenient administrative lines you drew 5 years ago. Think about it. Maybe these new robots are tied into a cloud-based server network that needs intense off-site cooling. Does your scope account for that new functional reality? Or are you just drawing a neat little box around your corporate office and ignoring those indirect emissions? A robust EMS maps out the true footprint, the whole shebang.
There is a highly specific quote from our sources that I really want to emphasize here. It says, "Unjustified exclusions from the defined scope represent serious nonconformances." You guys, an auditor will look right through artificial boundaries. Let's say part of your new automated setup means outsourcing some complex waste treatment to a third-party vendor. If you exclude that process just because it's outsourced, or maybe because it's highly technical and a pain to document, that is a massive pitfall. You cannot outsource your ultimate environmental responsibility. You still influence that vendor's operations, so it absolutely has to stay within your EMS scope. Trying to hide complex processes doesn't protect you, it just guarantees a catastrophic failure at your next audit.
Next up is Clause 4.4, EMS Design, the system's architecture. All right, setting those boundaries was step one. Now we need the engine to actually run securely within them. ISO 14001 demands a total shift from just ticking compliance boxes to delivering verifiable environmental results. Remember our holographic overlay? It needs to proactively track specific, measurable outcomes, things like optimized resource consumption and minimized waste, to prove the EMS is actually integrated into your core business strategy. The system has to be performance-driven. If the shiny new automation is supposed to make operations greener and more cost-effective, the EMS design must actively prove it. Are we actually using 20% less water? Is hazardous waste down by a ton a week? If your architecture can't capture the hard data to validate your investment, well, the system just isn't doing its job. Moving on to Clause 6.1, Environmental Aspects, Anticipating the Ripples. As those automated machines spin up on the floor, we absolutely have to anticipate the ripples. The standard is extremely explicit here. You cannot rely on last year's data when your daily operations are evolving this fast. New tech demands a proactive, change-triggered review to assess fresh risks and, fresh opportunities. Think about it. Did the new automation introduce a totally different kind of hazardous lubricant that your staff has no idea how to handle? Does the faster processing speed suck up way more cooling water from the local supply? A change-triggered review is the only reliable way to catch these fresh environmental interactions before they blow up into expensive violations or massive bottlenecks. And this perfectly illustrates the life cycle perspective the standard mandates. We aren't just looking at the factory floor in isolation anymore. It's like a giant puzzle. When we upgrade production, how does that impact the rest of the chain? Faster output might mean you need completely different upstream raw materials, maybe ones with a heavier carbon footprint. You might have to totally redesign your packaging for downstream distribution just to keep up. It could even completely change how the final product gets dismantled and disposed of at the end of its life. The EMS has to evaluate this entire chain reaction. Because the last thing we want is to solve a problem in manufacturing only to accidentally trigger an environmental crisis in shipping or disposal, right? All right, Clause 6.2, Environmental Objectives, Targeting the Future. Now that we've mapped out the new risks, we have to set our sights on the future. And let me tell you, vague goals like going green or reducing our footprint, those do not survive a professional audit, and they definitely don't drive real business value. ISO 14001 requires strictly quantifiable targets. Let's look at a concrete example. Say you aim for exactly an 18% reduction in volatile organic compound emissions over 2 years, driven specifically by the efficiencies of your new automation. That is a hard, measurable target. It's anchored to a clear baseline so you can objectively prove your progress to both auditors and shareholders. But, how do we actually hit that 18% reduction in the real world? To make sure these objectives aren't just empty corporate promises, the standard requires a strictly structured action plan. This thing needs to spell out exactly what action will be taken, who is personally accountable for it, how it'll be measured, and the exact, unforgiving timeline to get it done. This framework is a real game changer. It transforms a nice-sounding environmental policy into a rigorous operational mandate. It strips away all that ambiguity that usually causes sustainability projects to fail. When everyone knows their exact role and the deadline, environmental performance finally aligns directly with overall facility productivity. Finally, let's look at Clause 6.3, Planning of Changes, Closing the Loop. To tie this whole shebang together and avoid systemic failure, Clause 6.3 mandates that every single ripple of our factory upgrade is proactively vetted. We have to evaluate the long-term consequences of the automation, like, do we actually have the capital and the trained personnel to safely manage these new waste streams? Are the leadership roles clearly defined for monitoring the new emissions? And this is absolutely crucial, will this massive operational shift accidentally jeopardize our current environmental permits? All of these questions have to be answered, and the strategy's locked in long before anyone flips the switch on that new factory floor. Now, when you actually plan for change systematically instead of just reacting to it, a pretty fascinating thing happens. During that chaotic transition phase, performance metrics might dip or just stabilize for a minute. But because your framework is sound, performance ultimately scales right up toward that aggressive continual improvement target. By deeply integrating Clause 6.3, the automation upgrade stops being this terrifying compliance risk. Instead, it turns into a powerful, data-backed driver for getting better. The management system absorbs the shock of the new tech, recalibrates, and drives the whole organization toward a much more efficient, profitable, and green future. So, let me leave you with this question. Think about your own organizational boundaries. If a massive, disruptive technological upgrade hit your production floor tomorrow morning, are you truly prepared to systematically manage those inevitable ripples of change? Or are hidden risks, undocumented aspects, and fake scope boundaries just waiting in the wings to sabotage your next audit? ISO 14001:2026 gives you the exact architectural blueprint you need to survive in a rapidly evolving industrial world. But ultimately,
It's completely up to you to build it robustly enough to withstand the future.